The Don Dale Youth Detention Centre in Darwin has for years been one of the most shameful institutions in Australia's history. The most notorious moment in this facility's litany of horror was when ABC's Four Corners broadcast a show called Australia's Shame in July 2016. It showed a troubled teenager called Dylan Voller chained to a chair in a concrete cell with a black hood over his head. The nation reeled in shock. Then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull called an immediate Royal Commission into the Northern Territory's juvenile justice system. When the Commission reported a year later, it found, quote, shocking and systemic failures, unquote, and recommended Don Dale be shut down immediately. 5 years later, Don Dale is still open, and the Territory government is still neglecting its duties to the inmates. The ABC recently obtained documents under Freedom of Information, because of course these things aren't freely shared, that show the government has, quote, failed to adhere to a key part of its own legislation for more than a year, unquote. That requirement was for independent visitors to inspect the facility every month and report back to the minister with any concerns. But, says the ABC this week, quote, between April last year and June this year, when a total of 28 visits should have occurred, only 2 were undertaken, unquote. During one of those visits, the Observer saw blood smeared on the wall of a cell, which had not been cleaned because, the Observer was told, there wasn't enough staff. If that's any indication of what's going on in Don Dale now, then we might need another Royal Commission. In a pathetic attempt to cover itself, the Territory government, having initially tried to restrict the ABC's access to records on the matter, blamed COVID for the lack of inspection visits, as if catching a flu was more important than caring for the most troubled and disadvantaged kids in Australia. Now, nobody should pretend that dealing with troubled teenagers in the Territory is a walk in the park. It's not. Most of these kids have since birth known nothing but alcoholism, violence, loneliness and despair. Some have never once experienced the familial love that most other people take for granted. By the time they reach Don Dale, the damage done to them is almost impossible to reverse. You can't blame this on the supposedly systemic racism of Australia. Most Australians genuinely despair for the kids who wind up at Don Dale. You don't need to be a social worker to identify the cause of this. It's lack of schooling and lack of employment, both of which are a consequence of the breakdown of families. Cartoonist Bill Leak dared to publish an image depicting this in 2016, and as a result was vilified by leftists across the nation. His cartoon, blaming a deadbeat dad for the trouble his kid wound up in, was deliberately misinterpreted as racist. Leak, who was a close friend of mine until he died of a heart attack in 2017, was anything but racist. The vitriolic response to the cartoon focused on the supposed offence towards Indigenous dads, but disturbingly overlooked the one person Leak cared about the most, the poor, neglected child. 5 years later, that child is still being neglected. And the virtue signalling that enables all the most destructive and idiotic policies also continues. One of the first things Prime Minister Anthony Albanese did after winning office was to abolish the cashless debit card, which had been introduced by the Coalition in 2016 to prevent Indigenous people blowing their welfare checks on alcohol and drugs. To add to the trauma, the Territory government also lifted its grog bans on troubled communities. In her maiden speech to Parliament, the wonderful new Northern Territory Senator Jacinda Price said, quote, I could not offer 2 more appalling examples of legislation pushed by left-wing elites that are guaranteed to worsen the lives of Indigenous people, unquote. Here's another story that will have leftists all over it. The ABC reports today that, quote, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island children are nearly 10 times more likely to be removed from their families by Child Protection Services compared to non-Aboriginal children, and data shows the number of Indigenous children in out-of-home care is projected to double by 2029, unquote. This is alarming, and we should be addressing the cause of this as a priority. Breaking families up should always be a last resort, but it should also be an option, if only for the sake of the child. If an Indigenous child is growing up in conditions that are unacceptable for white kids, then a foster home needs to be found. To differentiate between the welfare of black and white kids in these depressing circumstances and helping white kids while leaving Indigenous kids to endure the violence and neglect is, by any definition, racist. And doing so will only guarantee that more and more kids will find themselves locked up in the hellhole of Dondale Youth Detention Centre.